You're listening to Out of the Box Podcast with Rosie Tran. Out of the Box is sponsored by hugmetees.com. Spread love, give a hug, hugmetees.com. Guys, we are now on SoundCloud. I'm excited about all the new SoundCloud listeners, but for those of you who are on iTunes, if you have a SoundCloud account, we would greatly appreciate you heading over to SoundCloud and clicking on the follow button and also sharing through SoundCloud. As always, we are on iTunes and Stitcher Radio, and we absolutely love and appreciate positive comments on iTunes. Go on iTunes.com and log into your account and look for Out of the Box Podcasts. You can leave a positive review or click on subscribe, and that helps us get a lot more new listeners through the subscription because it pushes our numbers up and helps other people find the podcast. I am really excited today. I am here with Professor of Psychology at Knox College, and he has a book out called The High Price of Materialism. Professor Tim Kasser. How are you, Tim?
I'm doing great. And yourself?
Great. I'm really excited to have you here because you're talking about a really important topic and writing about an important topic that's really affecting our greater world in general, and that's our crazy obsession with materialism.
Absolutely. That's pretty much describes 21st century America, huh?
It is. And it's funny because it seems like this model of industrialization and production isn't really vibing with the value system that we have as Americans. And not just that, but people in general.
Well, I think it's kind of, I think there's a lot of truth to that. You know, I think that capitalism and consumer capitalism and the kind of corporate capitalism we have that so dominates America today, you know, it pushes on us a really materialistic value orientation, and it's based on that. It's based all around trying to encourage people to focus their lives around making a lot of money and having a lot of possessions and obtaining a lot of wealth and status. And, you know, that might work pretty well for helping economic growth and making some tax revenue for the government and big profits for businesses. But what the research we've been doing shows is that it really comes at a cost for people's well-being as well as costs for society and the planet.
Not just that, but it doesn't actually make people happy. And it seems like to have a very high consumer culture, you have to feed off of people's insecurities, which is not really healthy.
That's absolutely right. Yeah, I think it's one of the main things that advertisers have known for a long time is that, you know, one of the quickest ways to get people to buy something is to tell them that, you know, they're not pretty enough, they're not rich enough, they're not of enough high status, they're not competent enough, or they're not safe either, physically safe, and that the product that they're suggesting you ought to buy is one that will somehow compensate for those insecurities. And, you know, advertisers have done that for a long time. And I think politicians play into it a lot, too. You know, if we don't get economic growth up, this bad thing's going to happen or that bad thing's going to happen. And
we're going to collapse. Everyone's going to lose their jobs. The world, you know, the world's going to fall apart, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, you look back at after the September 11th attacks, one of the things that President George Bush said Americans should do would be to get back to shopping, you know, and get back to conducting business, because that was what was going to help the economy and therefore the nation, you know. And so even, you know, using that terrible insecurity that was brought on by those attacks to encourage people to move in an economic, materialistic way.
Now, the studies that you have done focus on a lot of intrinsic happiness, and those are things that, for the listeners who don't understand, are things like building self-confidence, helping others. They're things that are totally free and don't cost any money, but actually create more long-lasting happiness. Maybe you can clarify or elaborate a little bit more.
You bet. Well, what we really do is we distinguish between two different kinds of values, two different value orientations or goal orientations. So on the one hand, we have those materialistic values, or what in our science writing we oftentimes call the extrinsic values. And those are values that are focused on getting rewards or having status or having people praise us. And so those are things like money and image and popularity, etc. And as we've already sort of briefly noted, the research shows that the more that you focus on those values, the less happy you tend to be, more depressed you tend to be, more anxious you tend to be, etc. Now we contrast those extrinsic values with what we call the intrinsic values. And we call these the intrinsic values because from our theoretical perspective, they're intrinsically satisfying to pursue because they do a good job of meeting our psychological needs, those needs that really are necessary for us to be well and to thrive. The three main intrinsic values that we focused on are what are called self-acceptance or personal growth. So that's like pursuing your own interests, doing the things that really help you to grow as a person. Then the second one is affiliation. This is about having close interpersonal relationships with your family and friends. And then the third one is community feeling. This is the desire to help the broader world be a better place. So not just to help your family, but to help polar bears or people in some other country or whatever.
So kind of like having a purpose-driven life, something bigger than yourself.
Yes, that's a big part of it, is having, kind of we actually in our research call community feeling one of the transcendent values. It's an intrinsic transcendent value because it is both inherently satisfying to pursue, that's the intrinsic part, and it's transcendent because it's about something bigger than you, okay? And what we find is that the more that people pursue these intrinsic values relative to those extrinsic values, then they tend to be happier, they tend to be less depressed, less anxious, less likely to abuse substances, more satisfied with their lives, etc.
Now, it sounds like the extrinsic values are actually just a completely morphed and messed up way of trying to fulfill the intrinsic values, because image and status and money and all those other things, they're just kind of ways to get love in a way or get fulfilled, but they're just kind of misguided.
Well, that's another reason that we call them extrinsic, actually. So that's a great question because they're extrinsic in the sense that they're not ends in themselves. They're means to some other ends, okay? You're doing them for this other extrinsic reason, yeah. And, again, if you take a look at the advertisements, if you buy the diamond ring, then she's going to love you. Or if you use this kind of shampoo, then, you'll be beautiful. And people will love you. I think a lot of it is about love and attraction, but some of it is about also kind of feeling competent, sort of showing that, you
have it all together, right? Yeah,
that you have it all together. That if I have this car, it shows that I've made it and that I really am a successful person. And again, this is one of the things that I think advertisers do really well is they manipulate those intrinsic values and try to convince you that the way to satisfy those intrinsic values or successfully pursue those intrinsic values is through consumption, right? And, the example that I use all the time has to do with meditation, So nowadays, if you want to start meditating, you need to buy the meditation book and you need to buy the incense and you need to buy the tape and you need to buy the mat, right?
Something that's free has been commercialized.
That's exactly right. All the Buddha did was to sit down underneath a tree, right? And so, and on and on and on, the best things about love, are free. And, I always tell people, boy, if you have to buy a diamond ring to, get her to marry you, you're probably in trouble. It's not, that's not what the basis of those intrinsic values is really about.
Actually, but I think, Tim, there's a study that shows it's really funny. There's a study that shows the correlation between failed marriages and the size of the diamond ring, believe it or not.
Really? And it's a positive correlation?
It's the bigger the diamond ring, the lower the chances the marriage will last.
I'd love to see that. I'm going to have to look around for that.
You, but I'll send it to you. But
Please do.
I was laughing so hard. It's the smaller the diamond ring, the higher the chances the marriage will last longer.
Well, my marriage should be in good shape because I gave my wife a pine cone. So anyway, I think it's back to that insecurity point that we were making before, that people kind of feel insecure about whether or not they're going to be loved. They feel kind of insecure about whether or not they've been competent. And of course, the advertising messages and lots of other messages sort of play on that. We see all these images of beautiful, successful people. And if we compare ourselves to them, which people do when they see them on TV and elsewhere, then, you end up feeling, not so good. Or if you're looking at other people's Facebook pages, right, then that insecurity starts to kick in. And what consumerism does is to provide a fairly quick path to at least providing a temporary salve on those insecurities. Of course, it doesn't last very long, and that's why you need to go buy something else.
And not just that, but it's all a facade, because there are, the way that our production cycle is set up, you can go to a factory in the third world and the high-end products are being made in the same factory as the low-end.
Sure.
So you're really paying for that marketing, that image. And that's just absolutely ridiculous, because, maybe you're wearing a shirt from Target and it's the same, factory that's making Ralph Lauren polo or whatever. I'm just making a theoretical example, but it's
Right.
shown that they're outsourced to the same factories. So, you're just creating corporate profits. Now, the thing that bugs me is, you're doing some really great work, and I've heard a lot of, watched a lot of documentaries and read books about this topic. There seems to be an attack on this mentality as your anti-capitalist, you're socialist, you're anti, big business. And that's not necessarily true. There are businesses who have conscious capitalism and have reworked their consumer model to actually be sustainable and help the environment and still make profits. Why do you think this idea of, not consuming like crazy is attacked as this crazy socialist, anti-capitalist idea?
Well, I've certainly been called all of those things in my career and worse, probably. Well, I do think that the message to consume less is a very threatening one to the standard view of capitalism. Mm-hmm. And there's a variety of reasons for that. One of them is that, the people who really promote capitalism, kind of the really neoliberal folks, believe that, well, what should everybody be doing? They should be pursuing their self-interest. And mm-hmm. What is self-interest defined as? It's defined as profit, money, and consumption. And so from that perspective, if you're saying, well, consume less, you're actually arguing that people should not be pursuing their own self-interests, right? Which, from the capital...
Well, that's a bit extreme. There's a middle ground.
Well, that's my view, and there are also other interests one might want to pursue besides just money and wealth and possessions.
You're saying this is an argument against what you're promoting.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to say, is that what capitalists say is that, you're trying to convince people to do things that aren't in their self-interest because they believe self-interest is about amassing wealth and consumption and all of the rest.
They kind of discount the other values.
That's absolutely right. And I think that's one of the main points that I've been trying to make in a lot of my writing, especially over the last 10 years or so, where, what happens is, and we know this from the empirical research, that what happens is that by thinking about money, you actually end up suppressing the intrinsic values. So I use the metaphor of a seesaw a lot. So when you activate the ideas of money in people's minds, what ends up happening is that kind of crowds out those intrinsic values. It makes us care less about the things that we do just because it's interesting. It makes us care less about other people. It makes us care less about society and the broader environment. And so I think, what's happened in capitalism is that it's, money has become such a dominant part of the ideology that other values that are part of what it means to be human get crowded out. Don't get me wrong. I've never tried to say that there's something unnatural about pursuing money and possessions. I think it's a very basic part of being a human. I think the problem is that under consumer capitalism, that particular value is raised to be the highest good. And by doing that, you end up crowding out these intrinsic values and not paying as much attention to these other things that can promote happiness, as well as promote, a more civil society and a more sustainable earth.
It is, and I never understood some of the values because they literally don't make sense. A lot of Wall Street is all about beating earnings, next quarter, more. Well, there's only a certain amount of people on earth, and there's only a certain amount of, say I'm talking about McDonald's stock. There's only a certain amount of cheeseburgers you can eat. You can't eat any more cheeseburgers. So the idea of constant growth, it doesn't even make logical sense.
It certainly doesn't make logical sense on a finite planet. No,
it doesn't. And not only that, but it's like, if you're, let's say you made $100 million this quarter. I'm just using a random example. Why do you need to make $200 million next quarter if you're still in the green every quarter? It just doesn't. I don't understand it. It's like it doesn't seem very logical.
Well, but it doesn't from an outside perspective, no. But from the internal perspective of consumer corporate capitalism, it makes perfect sense because the purpose of the corporation is to maximize profit for shareholders. And the shareholder always wants the corporation to be making more and more money so that the shareholder can be paid dividends or so that the shareholder can sell his or her stock at a profit. And of course, the government wants all of that to be the case too, because the government depends upon tax revenue under a capitalist system from economic growth, because then they can tax those corporate profits, albeit at a fairly low rate. Mm-hmm. They can tax the earnings off of capital gains. They can tax the wages that workers make from working from those for those corporations, and then they can tax the income or the sales that they get when consumers buy stuff. So and then they can use all of that money to build roads or fund schools or invade Iraq and Afghanistan, mm-hmm. Because then they have the revenue from those corporate profits in order to do the things that the government wants done. And of course, who is it that's funding most of the people in the government's re-elections? Big corporations and rich people. So there's an internal logic to the cycle. And as somebody who's spent the last 20 years critiquing capitalism, I have to give it its due in the sense that it is a brilliant system. It really is a brilliant system for maximizing economic growth and for dangling candy in front of people to keep them motivated to do things that ultimately are not in their best self-interest, speaking in a broad scheme. But if you just define self-interest solely in the way that capitalism does, i.e. money and possessions, it actually works pretty well for a good chunk of people.
I understand what you're saying, but to me, it still doesn't make logical sense, especially with the idea that, increased consumption is in a line, in my mind, actually with poor products. Because, let's say I get an iPhone. Well, if my iPhone is good, it should last me 10 years. I shouldn't have to get a new iPhone in 2 years, mm-hmm. unless it's a crappy product. So it's in a way, they're kind of promoting, planned obsolescence where these products, you want them to fail so people will buy more of them, which doesn't make any sense.
Well, again, I don't want to be an apologist for capitalism because I'm certainly not. I agree from your perspective. It doesn't make any sense. But why doesn't it make any sense? Because you're applying a value system that is not about you always having the newest, right? So if you wait 10 years to, let's say your iPhone does last 10 years, okay? You now are 10 years behind the game in terms of what an iPhone can do, all right? So you also apparently don't care about the status if you hold on to your iPhone. You've said that the value doesn't matter to me. What matters to me is to have something that I'm not continually throwing away, maybe because you care about the environment, let's say, okay? But and that's my whole point here is that when you look at capitalism through the lens of the intrinsic values, then you're right. It doesn't make any sense. When you look at capitalism through the lens of its extrinsic values, it makes perfect sense. And what we need, and this is what I've been arguing now for a while, what we need is to develop business models and develop an economic system and develop a political system which instead of looking at, all good things come from economic growth and come from profit, that says, there's a place for that. But really what we need is an economic system that balances all these different values. We need a political system that takes other values into consideration. We need lifestyles that take all these other values into consideration. And how are we going to build those? And I think this is really, to use a capitalist metaphor, the $64 question, a $64,000 question here. What is it that we can do in order to infuse these intrinsic values into our lifestyles, into our political economic systems, into our business models?
Well, thankfully, I think that shift is happening now, very slowly but surely. I know a lot of people who are just rejecting this consumer lifestyle to the point where, there's so many different movements. There's a tiny house movement. I don't know if you've heard of that one.
Sure.
Where people are trying to minimize and have a more free time and not focus so much on the constant consumerism. And like you said, the studies have shown it just doesn't bring you happiness. Yet we're on these rat race hamster wheels.
Whereas, you mentioned about how people have decided, not to focus so much on consumerism and pursue other things. In the academic literature, there's two terms for that. One is called downshifting. Another is called voluntary simplicity. It's making a choice voluntarily to live a materially more simple lifestyle than you might otherwise. And about 10 years ago, Kirk Brown and I did a study where we compared 200 people who were self-identified voluntary simplifiers with 200 matched mainstream Americans. They were matched on age and gender and zip code. And what we found was that the voluntary simplifiers were happier than the mainstream Americans, significantly happier, even though they had made less income. Okay, they only had about 2/3 of the income of the mainstream Americans, but they were significantly happier. And our analyses showed that those people who had downshifted, who had made this choice, the reason that they were happier seemed to be that they rejected those extrinsic values and they had organized their lives around the intrinsic values instead. So it's really good evidence suggesting just what you're talking about, and that this move towards a more simple life is one that really has some potential benefits. And I also want to mention that in addition to being happier, we found that the voluntary simplifiers also had lower ecological footprints. So they were living a happier life in a way that cost the earth less. So there's kind of a double benefit.
I think that the balance that you talk about is really important too, because like I said earlier, there's a lot of attack on what you're saying that, you're kind of promoting. First of all, I didn't hear you say anything about socialism, but I hear that a lot, that if you attack capitalists, you're just a communist or a socialist, which is absolutely, I don't think these people know what the definition of socialism is, because they're just throwing out random terms.
Sure.
But I hear that a lot. Oh, you're attacking capitalists. You're a socialist. I'm not advocating for socialism. What it seems like you're advocating is for a change in the current system. And I don't find anything wrong with that. That the healthcare system gets attacked a lot when people say, well, we need a change in the healthcare system. Well, you're just socialism. No, we just don't want all these crazy healthcare costs and people being pumped with pharmaceuticals. So I feel like there's a revolution going on in all areas of the system, because the system that we've been living with, it doesn't seem to be working in all areas, not just capitalism, but also healthcare and education and other areas. There seems to be this undercurrent of change going on, and I'm really excited about it. Like I said, the tiny house movement is one. There's a lot of millennials who are highly compensated because of their technical knowledge, who are living simply and then saving that money to try to retire early or do other pursuits as well. So there seems to be a lot of shift in just that idea that we need to constantly consume and just buy these big McMansions and drive Beamers and other things like that. Although it still exists, I've noticed that there's a change. And I think that global warming has actually influenced it, because like you said, this lifestyle that is being promoted is not very sustainable.
Oh, absolutely. It's funny to me because as I look at the trends, on the one hand, I do have the optimism that you mentioned, that there are a good number of people who, especially millennials and younger people, who do seem to be interested in alternative forms of ownership, who are interested in, kind of rebelling against consumer society. On the other hand, the unfortunate fact is that most of the evidence I'm aware of suggests that young people today endorse materialistic values at higher levels than people did 40 years ago and even 30, 25 years ago. And so, it may be that there's kind of a bifurcation happening here, that there's a group, and perhaps a larger group than historically was the case, but nonetheless some group of people who really are rejecting the kind of this consumer mentality. But on the other hand, most of the trends do suggest that materialism has been on the rise among young people. And if you think about it, and the data suggests that partly this is a function going back to insecurities. There's some evidence that I've published with Jean Twenge that shows that times of more economic insecurity and other kinds of insecurity partly explain why youth are more materialistic today. But there's also some evidence that shows that as advertising has become a bigger and bigger part of our economy, of course, all those messages encourage materialism. And so, that also explains these rises in materialism. So I wish I could be, don't get me wrong, I definitely think that there are wonderful trends happening. I think that there is a lot of good stuff that is occurring out there that people are grabbing a hold of. I'm not as confident that it's as high of a percentage as some people might think.
Well, Tim, I would also attribute that to you talk about capitalism being very, very smart and very tricky. What's going on as well is that these consumeristic and capitalistic ideas of the American ideal are now being projected into the developing countries and third world, which before did not have the financial means to be spending crazy the way we spend over here. And as China develops and other countries develop and get a middle class, when you're growing up in abject poverty and all of a sudden you get pushed into the middle class because of an economy developing and, you don't have the education or emotional intelligence, and then you're projected all these ideas, these corporations are actually taking advantage of and vulturizing members of developing countries because they don't know what's hitting them. They don't have the psychological understanding to know they're being brainwashed.
Well, I don't disagree with that, but I'm not so convinced that Americans have that psychological understanding either, that most Americans do. And certainly, when there's a lot of research that shows that, children under age 8 or 12 can't really get it. They don't really get this idea that advertising is trying to persuade them of things. And that's part of what makes advertising so powerful in that particular age group. And of course, that's when you're forming your values. That's when you're forming your identity. That's when a lot of these things start to become super important.
That's why they put the candy in the pay aisle, right where the kids can see it.
Well, and that's why they put product placement in all kinds of video games and web sites, and why there's advertising in schools and on and on and on. It's an effort to get to young consumers to help kind of cement that consumer mentality into their developing person. But on economically developing nations, I completely agree with you. This is exactly what globalization is designed to do, because it maximizes profit, usually for the wealthy countries, though, right? So most of the money that is made in those economically developing countries goes back out to the companies, the money that's made in the economically developing countries. The money the profit that's made there goes out back to the rich shareholders of corporations. It's a different form of colonialism in a lot of ways. And the marketers are right there. The marketers are right there trying to convince people to spend these better wages on consumer goods, because just like they've told us that that's going to be the path to happiness, that's what they tell people in economically developing nations as well.
And the sad thing is, there's been so many statistics that show that, we cannot sustain our current level of consumerism in America. Yet if these other, as far as the earth is concerned, destroying the earth and the finite resources because we're not developing in a 100% sustainable way, and then to have other countries take on our level of consumerism, I don't know if that's a very good idea.
No, it's absolutely not a good idea. I've read somewhere that if everybody can on Earth today, forget any more population growth, but if we all just consumed like Americans do, we'd need something like 5 or 6 more Earths. And obviously we don't have that. There don't appear to be any habitable planets in our solar system. And if there are any other ones out there, it's going to take us who knows how long to be able to ever get there because they're so far away. So this is the one Earth that we have. And, that we have to make a choice here about consumerism. Unfortunately, and I also do a lot of work in the environmental realm, consulting with environmental groups. I think the problem, a lot of environmental groups have decided that, green consumerism is the answer. If everybody bought a hybrid car and, changed the LED light bulbs, et cetera, that's going to solve the problem. And, don't get me wrong, I'm completely in favor of green consumerism. I think it's something that's going to be useful and that is part of the solution. But everything I've read suggests that it is not going to get us anywhere near sustainability for multiple reasons, in part because people will take the money that they saved and spend it on an airline flight someplace. And that's called the rebound effect. No, the research shows that.
No, I believe you. It's just funny because you're taking away from one thing and you're just doing it somewhere else, right? That's
absolutely right. Yeah. I mean, there are environmentalists who say that, one of the best things you could do would be to spend your money on some $10,000 statue and just put it in your backyard, and then it doesn't really have an ecological impact. And then you don't have the money left in order to go to Bali for the weekend or whatever. So, we obviously we need to consume less. I think that's obviously part of the answer. And I think it's a big part of the answer is to change and reduce our consumption patterns. And there is a lot of exciting stuff happening in that respect, with regard to, car sharing is another great example. In the sharing economy, if we shared cars and we shared lawnmowers and we shared books and we shared all kinds of other things, that would have, we can't share, I don't want to start sharing my toothbrush, but there are, there are plenty of kinds of things that we could share and reduce our consumption on. And that is a new and kind of emerging part of the economy that I think is exciting and is going to be interesting to watch as it goes forth. And we need more and more of those kinds of models and more, libraries that where you can borrow things other than just books.
Well, what you're saying is that green consumerism is a help and it helps the situation, but we need to scale back in general as a whole. And if everyone went green, it still wouldn't solve the problem because we're in a deep hole.
That's exactly right. And that's what I understand from all of the environmentalists who I speak with is green consumerism is good, but it's not going to take us far enough. But the reason that green consumerism gets so touted is because it's consistent with the capitalist economy. Okay. It still desires high levels of consumption. Companies can still make a big profit, if you go and you buy a hybrid car. But profit is going to go down if 10 people share one car. There's going to be a decrease in profit. Okay, it's much better for capitalism for 10 people to go buy 10 hybrid cars than it is for those 10 people to pitch in and buy one hybrid car and share with each other. And that's the threat to consumer capitalism, because it's a threat to economic growth, and it's a threat to profit, and it's a threat to workers' jobs. Okay, and that's where the logic of trying to only have green consumerism to solve our problems breaks down.
Now, Tim, I'm going to go really down a rabbit hole with you. Just bear with me.
Okay.
Now, by the government supporting large corporations, it seems like they're actually promoting capitalism, whereas if they actually let unfettered capitalism go off, it might fail itself. Let me explain. So right now, the government has these huge subsidies for oil consumption, right?
Sure.
Which is promoting oil consumption. But in Europe, for example, they just let it go ride in the market, and therefore gasoline is extremely expensive in Europe, and so people actually consume less and use more public transportation. The same thing with GMO corn and other thing. The U.S. subsidizes these large corporate farming, and so then that pushes people to buy more of these products, where if they just let the free market, actually capitalism, ride out, the cost of food would go up and people would not be buying all these crazy processed food products. Does that make any sense?
Well, it makes perfect sense. I think another example is that, the amount of subsidies that are put into road construction and, interstate construction and the airports, just it's so much higher than the pittance that is given to our public transportation Amtrak train system. Okay.
What I'm saying is it's basically is socialism. It's just corporate socialism.
Well, yeah. I mean, what some people say is that, what corporations do under this government is they internalize the benefits, but they externalize the costs, right? So who ends up picking up all of those costs? Well, the taxpayer
the little guys.
Right? That's exactly right. Or the same is true, with a corporation like Walmart. So Walmart sets it up so that they don't hire most of their employees so that they have to pay them benefits. So what happens when they get sick? Well, then they have to, rely on public aid. Well, public aid is you and me and, all the other people in America who are paying taxes. Okay. And so, but that's a good strategy for Walmart, because then that lowers their bottom line, because they're not having to pay for the health insurance for their employees, et cetera. We could go on and on and on. And I think, the problem is, and part it goes back to campaign finance. Who is it that is funding these massive elections, that cost hundreds of millions of dollars? Well, by and large, there's a great website called Open Secrets, where if you go there, you can see all of the different corporations which are funding the senators and the Congress people and the presidential elections. And it's, we're talking, especially since the Citizens United case in 2010, what we have here is
the super PACs, correct?
Pardon me?
Is that related to the super PACs?
Yes, exactly.
Okay, got it.
Okay, yeah, where basically it took away how much people, any limits on making campaign finance or donations, right? And so what you end up having is a government which is by and large funded and controlled by and in conversation with corporations, and it's a true overlap. So I do think that that there's some correct. I've never heard it called corporate socialism, but I do think that there is a truth to that. It's a government which is mostly set up to help corporations and business do well.
I call it that because it bugs me when people say, "Oh, well, you're anti-capitalism." Actually, no. If they were to let the free market ride, a lot of things would correct themselves. The government is paying subsidies to these large corporations and giving them huge tax breaks, which is actually, like I said, a form of corporate socialism. It's socialism, just not for the little guy like me and you.
Well, I agree with that, but I do think, though, if we just had a completely free and unbridled capitalism, that
could be bad.
Well, yeah, I think that's absolutely right. Because essentially it's just going to, as long as money is power, those who have money are going to be the ones who are going to set up the system for us, and you're going to have less and less regulation. The government does do some regulations, there are some environmental regulations, there are work regulations, and et cetera, that do hold back corporations to some extent. And that's in part because There's a lot of people like you and me who say corporations have too much power, and we're the ones who ultimately do vote, right? And so I do think that there's that balance that government has to find, and to me, that's it goes back to this issue we were talking about before. How can we create a political structure and an economic structure and a business structure which balances multiple values? Given that the seesaw has gone too far to the extrinsic, how are we going to bring the intrinsic back in? How are we going to rein in the corporations more, take away some of those subsidies, and create a more sustainable and hopefully happier world too? That's the big question.
I agree with you. I wasn't advocating for a completely free market society. What my point was that people who point to what we're advocating as socialism, I'm saying there is a corporate socialism that they tend to ignore.
Yes, I completely agree with you. And I think that that it's always interesting. You can talk to people who will complain about, oh, well, we give all this money for, welfare and such like that. But then
what about the trillions that we give in corporate subsidies for GMO corn and for, all this other stuff? So that's what I really was making a point to clarify my point for the listeners. I wasn't advocating for crazy free market, but for those who point to what we're talking about as, socialism, I'm saying, okay, what about the corporate socialism? What about the government subsidies for oil companies and other things like that? And sorry,
I think that that's okay. I mean, I think that the issue here, and you pointed to this earlier in our conversation. When people critique me or you and say, "Oh, you're a communist or you're a socialist," no, I'm not either of those. But I'm, and that's the problem, is that we don't really have the well-articulated terminology and the well-articulated vision of what the alternative to hypercapitalism is, right? We don't have that where we can say, no, I'm not a socialist, no, I'm not a communist. What I am is a Bullist, okay, whatever bull is. And I think I think what we need to do, like I have my long way of saying it,
Okay, Tim, you get to create a word, and we're going to try to get it into the Webster's dictionary.
Wouldn't that be something? Well, I'm not too good at that. Right,
I'm a Kasserist. I'm a Kasserist.
There we go. I can live with that. Right. If Kasserism means creating, an economy which tries to balance the extrinsic values with the intrinsic values, and that infuses the intrinsic values into our lifestyles and into our political and economic structures, then I'm happy to call that Kasserism.
That's awesome.
But there are many before me who've basically said the same thing, so I don't know that I should take credit for it.
I know, but if you get the word coined after you, Tim, come on, this is your legacy. Now let's talk about what you just said. That's very important. You said we got to find another way to measure an economy or do something. There's other countries who are doing this. They are actually doing this. Let's talk about that.
Sure. Well, a country like Bhutan is one of the primary examples that most people put forth. They have gross national happiness is what they're aiming for instead of maximizing gross national product. And when you take a look at the gross national happiness indicators that they use, it covers a wide variety of things from health to education to access to nature to cultural, opportunity to engage in cultural activities. It also includes the economy, but it's a multifaceted measure. And in fact, the Bhutanese, when they make decisions when they make policy decisions, they'll sort of project how a particular policy might or might not affect each of these different aspects of gross national happiness. And then they make their decision on that basis rather than just, will it be good for the economy? But, so in addition to countries like Bhutan who are using these alternative indicators, there are actually cities in the United States that are doing this too. So not too far from you in Los Angeles, the city of Santa Monica has gotten a grant that I helped consult on, actually, where they are developing and have developed already, actually, really interesting and good measures of the well-being of citizens of Santa Monica. And they're using those measures as a way to make decisions in City Hall, okay, and in city planning.
That's awesome.
About how it is that they're going to try to make policy changes in the city. Up in the Pacific Northwest, in Seattle and Oregon, there also has been a lot of movement in this direction. There's work in Jacksonville, Florida. There's been work in some cities in the UK as well. So I really think, to me, at the federal level, things are so dysfunctional at the moment that if we work at a more grassroots level, at a city level,
we can actually make some changes.
I think it's true. And I think if you look actually at what's happened in the last several years, both with kind of decriminalizing and legalizing marijuana and with gay marriage, what's interesting in both of those cases is that the success that's occurred really kind of caught fire because of things that were happening at a more local level, right? Mm-hmm. So this state does this and this state does that, and then pretty soon other states start to do it, and then the federal government catches up, okay? And I really think that that's a very good model for these alternative indicators as well, to try to do what we can in our cities and in our counties or in our states or regions. And that is important and can really have some effects. I think in America, we too often look to the federal government and we think it's the be-all and the end-all, when there's really enormous amounts of very powerful work that can be done at the city and regional level.
There is, and not only that, but there's more that can be done. A lot of people don't vote in local elections. They vote more in the national elections.
Yeah.
And, it's shown that your vote actually not only counts more when you vote locally because less people vote. So, instead of voting for one person, you really get, I think the last election in Los Angeles, the voter turnout was the lowest it's been in history. And I went out and vote. I think less than 20% of the people who registered to vote voted.
Yeah.
So my vote counted 10 people.
Well, I think the other thing about working at a local level is that you can actually go to the meetings, right? You can go to the chances that you're going to go, sit in on a Senate hearing are probably pretty slim. But you can go to a city hall meeting, you can go to your county board meeting, you can go and probably even have coffee with your alderman or your alderwoman, right? And by doing that, you really can have that sort of impact. And I do think that impact is good in and of itself, but it also holds the promise, and it goes back to Kasserism that we were talking about before.
Oh, you love it now. You're going to use it.
Sure. Who wouldn't, right? But it goes back to that issue that it gives people the chance to experiment with these alternative models, okay? It gives people a chance to see, oh, well, that worked pretty well. That didn't work as well. This seems to catch a lot of flack. This seems to excite a lot of people. So if we can play with these models at a local level, we can learn more and more so that as we begin to scale up to regional and state and hopefully one day federal levels, then we'll have made our mistakes earlier, hopefully, and have better models for later on.
Well, I want to talk about something that's actually linked to consumerism with local politics that you just mentioned that's really important, which is that when you're engaged in your community, when you're engaged in local politics, when you're engaged in reaching out and making a difference and you're minded in that way, you actually become empowered, whereas advertising and marketing wants you disempowered. They want you zombied out on the TV, buying, working as much as you can to get these unattainable, like you said, carrot on a stick, so that you are not socially engaged and you're kind of like this zombie who just goes, like you said, it feeds on insecurity, right? Yet if you're an empowered member of your community, if your image doesn't depend or your self-worth doesn't depend on having, a Louis Vuitton purse or a BMW, you're kind of like a superhero a little bit because you're like really empowered.
Yeah. Well, I think this gets at another literature that's in academia, the consumer versus citizen literature, right? And if we go back to what I was telling you about before with the seesaw, remember that the extrinsic values are those consumeristic values, but that intrinsic transcendent value is the value for community, is for trying to make the world a better place, for getting involved in something bigger than you. And your city is bigger than you, right? Okay. So, there's that distinction there too. Another really interesting study was done. There was a guy who did. Have you ever heard of? Do you know Google Ngram?
I don't.
It's this search thing you can do using Google. Speaking of a big corporation, you can use one of their search engines, and he searched over 5 million books that had been published in English over the last couple hundred years. And he searched for the word consumer, and he searched for the word citizen. And from like 1700 up until about 1950, the frequency of the word citizen was substantially higher than the frequency of the word consumer in books. But around 1950, citizens started to go down and consumers started to go up, until in the late 1970s or so, consumers surpassed citizen in terms of how frequently it's being used. Okay, and that has remained the same today. So the issue is just what you were talking about here. It's a shift from how we talk about people. We don't talk about people as, oh, well, citizens need to do this. We instead say consumers need to do this. Well, as soon as we start to call people consumers, it gets into all of those kind of zombie-ish qualities that you were just mentioning. But when we talk about people as citizens, we talk about them as people who have a voice. We talk about them as people who get engaged. We talk about them as people who speak back to power, right? Mm-hmm. When you're a consumer, how do you speak back to power? Well, you stop, buying Pepsi and instead you buy Coca-Cola, or, whatever it is. You boycott, right? Or you let your dollar vote for you. Again, that's worthwhile. It's important. But if you start to think that the only way you can have an impact on the world is through your purchasing decisions, you've completely bought into the capitalist mindset. Okay, the place of a citizen is very unclear in capitalism, and that's because capitalism doesn't incorporate those community values into its philosophy, and that's why we need to build up that community aspect of things. And again, we know from the research that when people get politically engaged, they're happier. I did a study with a guy named Malta Klar that was published a while back, where we compared people who were politically active with those who were less, and we found that the politically active people, so long as they weren't violently politically active, so the nonviolent politically active people were happier than less politically active people. We actually even did one experiment where we had people just engage in a very brief political activism action versus a control action, and that temporarily boosted their happiness. So, not only can you make something good happen in your community by getting active, you might actually be a little happier too.
It is. And not only that, but, a lot of people think that, they can't do anything. They have no power. And that is something, obviously these corporations are feeding our system and feeding our bigger politicians. And so they don't want you to be, active in your community and your policies, because you could possibly shift, the status quo. Another thing is, I think a lot of people, we're talking about marketing and consumerism is kind of feeding on people's insecurities and wanting you to be a zombie and all this stuff. And it kind of sounds like a conspiracy theory, but this is like basic marketing 101, right? This is basic psychology. This is not some weird conspiracy theory. The government's out to get you, blah, blah, blah. This is like, you can basic information that's out there, correct?
Yes, again, it's just the logic of the system, okay? It's not a conspiracy theory. And I get, I recognize sometimes when I'm talking about how it all works, it does sound like it's a conspiracy theory because it's so complicated and it makes so much of its own internal sense. And it does, it's just the way that system works. And it's very clear, in the marketing literature and in the advertising literature that appealing to fear and appealing to insecurities can have these kind of momentary effects when they're combined with saying, and here's how to solve your insecurity, go buy this. So, it's not something people are just spinning in their heads. It's what's actually happening out there in the world and has been for a while.
So I want to talk about the solution. What is the solution to this, problem? Because it can sound overwhelming. It can sound a little bit daunting to people who are like, okay, well, I'm being brainwashed. What can I do? What are some steps that people can take to fix and solve this problem and work towards having a different, world where it's not a lose-lose, but it's actually a win-win?
Sure. Well, from the way that I think, here's my basic understanding of how one approaches it. First, in your own personal life, you would do well to do three things. First, try to limit your exposure to those extrinsic materialistic messages. Cut back on how much you watch TV, cancel your Facebook page and all the ads that are on it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, so that you're less likely to continually be bombarded with those extrinsic messages. And when you still are exposed to those extrinsic messages, label them as such. Say, this is what I used to teach my kids when they were little. They're advertising to me. They're trying to make me feel insecure. They're trying to get my money. Okay.
Okay, like a game, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's what we used to do when they were little. But you can do it, at any age, right? Because it's still true, right? They are trying to make you feel insecure. They are trying to get your money, and so label what exists as extrinsic, and try to and that's going to defuse its power. A second thing I would say is that when you're starting to feel insecure, recognize that you feel insecure, and instead of engaging in the kind of consumeristic behaviors that you maybe usually would, ask yourself, what's something I can do instead that will help calm me down here for a little while, but isn't going to contribute to a society that I don't believe in, okay? Take a walk, call a friend, knit, play the piano, whatever. There's plenty of things one can do. Third, still in your individual life, ask yourself, how can I organize my life around my intrinsic values? I really think this is the crux of the matter. Ask yourself, how much of my life really is focused around extrinsic values versus intrinsic values? Why don't I spend as much time living my life around my intrinsic values as I'd like to? And what would that actually entail? For me, it's playing the piano and being with my family and doing the kinds of activism work that I do. For you, it might be something else. For somebody else, it's going to be yet another thing. The important part is to ask yourself that question and then start to make some concrete changes in your life. And don't try to do it all at once. My philosophy is do two things this year, cement them into your life, and then do two more things the next year, and two more the next year, and in 5 or 10 years, you'll have taken a lot of steps to changing your life.
It is, so and a lot of people complain about not having enough money and this and that. And once you shift your life, you'll start to realize that you actually make a lot of money. Whatever your income point is, you start to realize, wow, I actually make a lot of money.
That's right. Yeah. And if you stop spending it on things you don't really need, then you can begin to understand that better. A really great book for this, by the way, is called Your Money or Your Life, where you actually track every cent you spend, and then you rate how well it fits your values, how well it actually brought you happiness. Your Money or Your Life. It's a great book for this. I think the last thing I would say, though, what do we do in our individual lives? But, what do we do in our broader societal lives? I think that we've just talked a bunch about being involved in your community, and again, if you try to do everything, it's going to drive you nuts, okay? Pick one action that's broader than yourself, one bigger thing that you care about. Maybe it's getting a green space in your neighborhood. Maybe it's about an alternative indicator in your city. Maybe it's about, starting a co-op, whatever. It doesn't really matter exactly what the thing is, so long as it's moving towards shifting society in a way which begins to better enact those intrinsic values, and work on that thing, and do it, and join with others who are already doing it in your community. And that's the kind of thing that's going to create the revolution we're talking about, okay? If more and more people do those kinds of things and develop these alternative ways of living their lives and these alternative ways of organizing society, that's what's going to bring about the revolution from hyper-capitalism to whatever new thing it is that we're trying to Kasserism, to whatever new thing it is we're trying to bring about.
Well, Tim, thank you so much for all of your important information. Hopefully, the listeners will go out and make a difference in their community and in their lives thanks to what you shared with us. How can people find you online? Are you on Twitter, or are you...
No, I'm not. I don't do Twitter. I do have a website, so if you go onto any search engine and you type in my name, Tim, Kasser, Kasser, I will come up pretty quickly, and you'll be able to go to my home website, and there you'll be able to find information about organizations that I really encourage people to look into, books that I've written, and other kinds of things.
Guys, check out Tim's website and check out his books. And
also, if you go onto YouTube and you type in my name, you'll find a 5-minute animated video that I made with Center for a New American Dream. That's kind of a fun way that quickly summarizes a lot of this info.
Okay, everyone, go on YouTube and check out Tim's video. Tim, thank you so much for being a guest on our show.
You bet. I've enjoyed it, Rosie. Thank you.
Okay, guys, check out our sponsor, hugmetees.com. Spread love, give a hug, hugmetees.com. If you go check them out and you get a Hug Me Tee, you will get hugs. I have worn mine out and I get many, many, many hugs. So it's an awesome website, hugmetees.com. And as always, we are on Stitcher, iTunes, and SoundCloud. Guys, follow me on Twitter at FunnyRosie. And remember, if you want me to come and check out my act in your local area, then tweet at me at FunnyRosie and at your local comedy club, and that will help bring me to your town. And as always, go on iTunes, itunes.com, look up Out of the Box Podcast and click on subscribe and leave a positive comment as well. Positive comments are the number one way to help spread the word about the podcast. If you've already done that, you can check out outoftheboxpodcast.com and click on the donate button. We're now accepting Litecoins and Bitcoins and all alternative currency. Your donations help keep the podcast going. And if you have any questions or any future guests that you'd love to see on the podcast, you can send me an email at info@outoftheboxpodcast.com. Thank you for listening. This has been Out of the Box Podcast with Rosie Tran.